So today we're going to be taking a look at a scenario where World War III breaks out in 2022. Now I know that I've covered a lot of World War III scenarios in the history of my channel, and as history progresses, we get more and more information on what countries' stances are in geopolitical scenarios and how they would react to certain events. Now, as of recently, or as of 2022, the world has been going through a lot of interesting geopolitical events. Such events include Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's aggression towards Taiwan, and Sweden and Finland's NATO applications. Now, all three of these events are kind of connected in one way or another, and it's just, it kind of piles up, and eventually we can probably see another world conflict coming out of this. Now, I'm not saying that World War III is anywhere near the horizon, although, it might be. But what I'm saying is that with all this new information, it's time to make a new scenario. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. It helps the channel grow and it helps us reach our goals. Recently, I opened up my new Discord server, and if you want to join it, there's a link to it in the description below and in the top comments. I know there were some issues with the previous link where some people were getting kicked because of our verification bot. I've gone ahead and I fixed all of that, so you guys should be able to join now. It's basically set up like a country over there. We have a Senate, we have a House of Representatives, and we just have a government system. There's map channels, there's flag channels, and there's a bunch of cool stuff. So if you want to join it, then there once again is a link in the description below and possibly in the pinned comment. Anyway, enough with self-promotion and stuff like that. Let's go ahead and start the scenario. Now I'm going to be basing this off of the most likely way for World War III to start, and that is between Russia and NATO. Now, I know that pretty much all of my World War III scenarios start with Russia and NATO, and that's mostly because that's the most likely event to cause a world war. Alright, so we're going to be starting over here in Ukraine because that is another current conflict, and it is the most likely conflict that will lead into a worldwide conflict. I just had conflict 3 times. So as of today, June 2nd, this is sort of what it looks like over in Ukraine, with Russia taking over about 1/5 of the total country. We're going to have to do some fast tracking because Ukraine is holding back Russia, and they are slowly progressing, but it is kind of too slow for them to get anywhere near Poland, which is how we're going to ignite this war. So hypothetically, we can have Belarus joining in on this war and declaring war on Ukraine. And with this, we actually have Russia declaring full-on war on Ukraine. Now, Russia isn't using all of its military, it's using a small portion of it. Therefore, if they get their entire military involved, they would most likely be able to roll over Ukraine and, well, I wouldn't say roll over, but they'd most likely have a lot more progress. So with Russia's full military involved, we have them breaking through any stalemates along here in the east and meeting up with the Dnieper River. Belarusian troops move into the Kyiv region as well as northern Ukraine, and at this point, Ukraine is suffering a massive invasion. Russian and Belarusian troops push over towards Kyiv, and the Battle of Kyiv starts. Down south, they push across the Dnieper River and start to invade mainland Ukraine, and it is at this point that we have an interesting scenario playing out. Now, Russia has been making some interesting statements as of recently. A lot of people within the government and their Kremlin-run news network have suggested that denazifying NATO would be a priority. Now, this hasn't come from the official government, such as Putin himself, but it is kind of concerning to see that within the government-controlled news. It's most likely just talk, but we're going to assume that it isn't. As Belarus and Russia push down into western Ukraine, we have the start of the capitulation of Ukraine itself. It is at this time that Russia and Belarus make the decision to start their invasion of Poland. Now, Poland is considered a target by Russia in real life, yes, but they would probably not dare to invade as Poland is a member of NATO. But in this scenario, Russian and Belarusian troops push across the border as Poland is forced to start mobilization. One day after the invasion starts, Article 5 of NATO is activated and all 30 member states join in. Now all of NATO is starting to mobilize and send troops into Europe, where they hope to beat back the Russians and push them back to Moscow. At this time, NATO's support and unity for each other is at an all-time high, and patriotism within the alliance runs high. This is the first ever time NATO has been activated in a global well, I guess the war on terror wasn't really a global thing, was more of a centered in the Middle East thing, but this will lead into a global conflict. So this is the first time that NATO has been called into a global conflict. I'm also just realizing that I didn't color in the Baltics, and then I accidentally colored in Sweden, but that's okay because we're going to assume that Sweden and Finland join the war on NATO's side. So yeah, now we have Russia versus Europe. Russian troops immediately start operations in the Baltic states, and down in Ukraine, the country is split in half. We have the Red Team meeting up with Kaliningrad and pushing out into Lithuania, who would soon capitulate over to the Russians. Followed by this, we have a slow but steady squeeze up into Latvia and Estonia, and then we have the capturing of Riga. From here, western Latvia falls, and now we have Latvian and Estonian troops on the withdrawal. Mainland Estonia completely falls, and troops are forced to evacuate to these 2 Estonian islands. The Russians push out from Kaliningrad and down into Poland. While back over in Ukraine, Russians push down to capture Odessa. In Finland, Russian troops cross over the border and start to invade Finland. And yeah, Russia seems to be doing very good here. But we do have to realize that Russia's army was already mobilized and in the process of invading Ukraine. It's not too unlikely that Russia would be able to transport these troops around pretty quickly and start invading surrounding countries. It's also probably likely that they already had troops along the border of these countries, whereas NATO, who was kind of on alert, really isn't mobilized for this war. But now at this point they are mobilized and they are ready to push these borders back. Starting off in Finland, we have Finnish troops pushing out the Russians, and back in Poland we have Polish troops pushing back Belarusian troops. NATO struggles to push back the Kaliningrad offensive, but they do make progress towards Belarus. In Estonia, a NATO naval landing is made, which ends up capturing the capital of Estonia. From here, another one is made over here in the top of Latvia. This also goes successful and they managed to capture Riga. And also, I'm not really going to cover naval too much because there isn't really much aspect to it. It's more of a land-based war, but NATO has complete control over the Baltic Sea and as well as a majority of the Black Sea, although it is kind of contested. Over in Ukraine, Romanian and Ukrainian troops make a slight offensive back towards Russia, which ends up capturing Odessa. Back over in mainland Ukraine, we have the Russian troops steamrolling through the countryside. Eventually, these troops start to push down into northern Romania. Basically, all of Ukraine has been lost to Russia, except for the small sliver of land over here, and then the Odessa area. Back in the Baltics, we have NATO troops linking up and making one big united Baltic front. But it's at this point that the war gets interesting. Russia starts to call in allies as they realize that they can't beat NATO, and the most likely event for them even coming close to winning is stalemating. So with this, to get a hold of CSTO members, these members include Belarus, who was already in the war, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Tajikistan is also a member, but they are in conflict with Kyrgyzstan in some sort of way, so I doubt they would join in aid of them. And as for the rest of Central Asia, they decide to stay out of the war. But with Armenia joining the war, we have Azerbaijan joining the war, as they are not with good terms with Armenia. We also have Georgia joining this war, who has already lost some land over to Russia. And with these three countries joining in, we have the ignition of the Middle Eastern front. Iran declares war on Turkey, and from here everything falls apart. We have Saudi Arabia in turn declaring war on Iran. The UAE and Qatar come to the assistance of NATO. Yemen officially declares war on Saudi Arabia. Oman comes to Saudi Arabia's aid. Kuwait joins the war as requested by the United States. Jordan decides to pick a side. Iran convinces Iraq to join. And Syria is caught up in the mess along with Lebanon. In support of NATO and their ally, the United States, we have Israel joining, which in turn makes Palestine have to pick a side. And what I would consider to be all the Middle East, except for Egypt, has now picked a side in the war. Now, I do want to expand this over to Africa because I don't have much coverage of Africa in pretty much any of my videos. So, we're going to be having Morocco join, and they're joining the side of NATO because they mostly have good relations with the United States. But with Morocco joining, we have Algeria joining the war on the side of Russia due to bad relations with Morocco. I also believe that I can make this stem into a East African war with Egypt and Ethiopia. However, I don't know how to really pick out the sides here because the alignment of these countries is really interesting, especially with Egypt, who has good relations with the US and Russia. And it's kind of like an India in this scenario where they hold relations with both and really want to split either way in order to betray one of their allies. So Egypt will be staying out of this war, but if you want to let me know in the comments, let me know what side you think Egypt would be on in this conflict so far. Personally, I'd be leaning towards putting them on the blue team because Egypt does hold relations with Saudi Arabia. Egypt also recognizes Israel, one of the few Muslim countries to do so. So once again, they could possibly join the blue team, although I will leave this up to you guys. So yeah, a lot more of the world just got involved, and now we have probably over 50 countries. In addition to getting a lot of the Middle East to join Russia's side, we also have Venezuela and Cuba joining Russia's side. Now this would end up being a big mistake for both of these countries, as Colombia declares war on Venezuela as well as Guyana. Guyana and Venezuela also have a big border dispute, so that's why I included Guyana. And I was about to say we have Brazil joining, but I'm also going to leave that up to you guys as well. I don't think they would really pick a side in this war, but I know they don't like Venezuela at all. And I know Brazil also has relations with the United States and Russia, kind of once again like Egypt and India. So once again, I'll be leaving that up to you guys. I won't be including them in this scenario just because I'm not sure. So with America slightly distracted in the Americas, we have Russia putting in place a new plan. First off, Russia rolls over Georgia, and with the help of Iran, they take over all of Azerbaijan. Now I know that mountain does exist here, and I'm going to ignore that for the simplicity of the scenario and to kind of make it more interesting. From here, Russian and Iranian troops cross over into Turkey, and Turkey is on the defense over here in the east. However, they are not in the defense over here in the south as they push into Syria with the help of Saudi Arabia. Now, Iraq and Syria are very unstable countries, and I doubt they would be able to even hold off. They would most likely need the help of Iranian troops who are already fighting up here against Turkey. So with this, we can assume that Syria would fall pretty rapidly to the blue team. In addition addition to this, Lebanon would fall, as well as Palestine. And here we can see the emergence of a big front line in the Middle East. Over in Kuwait, Iraqi and Iranian troops push in and capture the country and start a slight invasion of Saudi Arabia. Down south in Yemen, we have Oman mainly focusing on taking out Yemen, but Saudi Arabia does provide its assistance. In Africa, we have Algeria pushing into northern Morocco, as well as southern Morocco. In the Americas, Colombian and American troops push across the border and start their entrance into Venezuela, but at the same time, we have Venezuelan troops pushing over into Guyana. In Cuba, the US makes a landing, and surprisingly enough, a lot of the civilians in Cuba start to rise up against their government in support of the Americans. And with this, we have the collapse of the Cuban government and the American takeover. So now with the war taking a more interesting approach, we can see a lot more countries are involved, and the front lines are getting interesting. Over in Europe, it hasn't moved much, but most of the world is focused on the new fronts, such as over here in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas. But next up, we have another event taking place that will completely change the war and make it last for probably a lot more years. That makes sense grammatically? And of course, I'm talking about China's invasion of Taiwan. In present day, this doesn't seem too unlikely because of China's incursions into Taiwanese airspace, and then of course them performing military exercises in the Strait of Taiwan. But now we have them actually invading the country, as they don't believe that the United States would do anything. But that's the thing, they do, and this turns into an even greater war. Japan and South Korea respond to this by declaring war on China, which in turn makes them join the war on the blue team. And we have North Korea declaring war on South Korea. The Philippines take an initiative to also help out with their allies. And then of course we also have Australia and New Zealand joining. In Central Asia, we have Mongolia joining the war in order to help with the supply between Russia and China. And we have India on a tightrope here. Sure, this is an opportunity to declare war on China, but it's also another opportunity to help out your ally Russia. But why would you do that? Because America, but then, China, that we can declare war on them. But then we have Turkey, but then we have Israel. So what about that? And then we also have Japan. So, I mean, what would India do? Most likely nothing. But if they were to join a side, it would most likely be on the side of the blue team. Russia is just one country that's their ally. It might be one of their biggest allies, but they have much more allies on the blue team than they do on the red team. So India refrains from joining this war solely because of Russia, but if you believe that India would join, then let me know in the comments. Now we have this war at its greatest extent. Chinese troops land in and take over Taiwan, while South Korean troops advance into the north. Japan does manage to make some landings along these Russian islands, but overall a lot of naval combat is being fought over here in the Sea of Japan. On the Arabian Peninsula, we have Yemen getting wiped out, and over in the Americas, American and Colombian troops manage to capitulate all of Venezuela. With this, America is no longer distracted in America and can now focus on Europe and eventually the Middle East, and then probably at the same time the Pacific. So speaking of Europe, Russia has made some advances, such as over here in Odessa, Russian troops managed to push back the Romanians and Ukrainians as they enter into Romania, and over here in Turkey they make progress along the Black Sea coast. Belarus manages to push back out. However, Russia does lose some land to Finland. The NATO operation in the Baltics continues to be a success as they liberate even more of the Baltic countries. Eventually, they meet the border of Kaliningrad. In Poland, the Poles manage to push back the Russians to Kaliningrad, and the supply line between Kaliningrad and Belarus is broken. With this, we have the complete isolation of Kaliningrad, and NATO troops start to attempt to enter. They are pretty successful over here in the east, but when it comes to taking ports and military bases, they do struggle. NATO now makes its next operation plan, which is Operation Ukraine. And it is what it sounds like. Basically, we just have NATO liberating Ukraine. Russian troops were ordered to hold their ground, however, the NATO troops continue to push in. In Poland, all of the red team troops are kicked out, and NATO troops start to line the border of Belarus. In Lithuania, we have a successful NATO counterattack, which completely kicks Russia out of southern Lithuania. However, over in Latvia, a Russian counterattack goes successfully, and they manage to relink up with the sea. Kaliningrad completely falls to NATO, and we have NATO starting Operation Belarus, which once again is what it sounds like. NATO troops start to enter into Belarus. So a lot of interesting things have occurred over here in Eastern Europe, specifically in Northern Eastern Europe, while in Southern Eastern Europe and Turkey, things are not going too well for NATO. In the Middle East, Iran and Iraq managed to push back the blue team, as a stalemate appears on the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. In North Africa, we have Spain and France aiding Morocco, which allows for them to kick out all Algerian troops and start the re-invasion of Algeria. French troops land in North Africa in assistance with the Spanish, and eventually all of the Algerian coast is captured by NATO and Morocco. From here, a slow advance into the country of Algeria is made, although it goes pretty rapidly after they take all of the coast, and a few weeks later we have the capitulation of Algeria. So that's another country down for NATO and the blue team, and now they really only have to worry about Asia, or I guess specifically Eurasia. Up on the Kola Peninsula, we have Nordic specialized units taking over the area, and overall another operation goes successfully as NATO pushes out and cuts off this entire area of Russia. Now this is pretty essential, one, because there is only one network of road system going up that connects all of it together, so by taking that over they control all the infrastructure of this region. This is also where a lot of Russia's nuclear bombs are, and I haven't mentioned anything about nuclear bombs themselves, so if you're new to the channel, then I want you to know that I typically do not use nukes in my scenarios because they just kind of throw everything out the window and just makes it so no one wins. My scenarios are mostly just based off of conventional warfare, and you know, some of the time it's not completely realistic, but that's okay because we're just here to have fun. Of course, everyone's gonna have different opinions from me. I doubt that anyone would come up with the same map and scenario that I have, so just keep that in mind as you get introduced to the channel and check out some of my other videos. But anyway, back to the scenario. All of the Kola Peninsula falls over to the blue team, and hence all of northern Russia. NATO troops hold a front line here as Russian troops also push up north to meet them. But Russia's biggest threat right now is Finland getting close to St. Petersburg. So they rearrange some divisions, take some out of the Baltics, and put them up north towards St. Petersburg, which allows for NATO to push back and start to retake some of these lands. Not all of them, but a good portion of them. Now, part of Russia's flaw in this plan was their actual withdrawal themselves. They left a good portion of Belarus's border undefended, as a lot of Belarusian troops were on the front line with NATO. So with this, NATO troops were able to push in from behind the front line and encircle a big portion of Belarusian troops. They continue to do this down south as Belarusian troops are ordered to retreat. But overall, we have two large encirclements of troops, and these are all wiped out. And with this, Belarus loses a large portion of its army. NATO pushes out and captures Minsk, and with this, Belarus starts to fall apart. Operation Ukraine continues to go a success as NATO troops start to liberate even more of western Ukraine, and with this, they also push into southern Belarus. And at this point, it is essentially just Russia fighting off NATO, as Belarus is barely holding on. Back in the Middle East, Turkish troops managed to push back Russian troops. However, Iranian and Iraqi troops managed to push back into Syria. Over in East Asia, we have South Korea continuing to push into North Korea until eventually they capture Pyongyang. Now keep in mind, this isn't just South Korea, it's also Japan and the Philippines sending troops in aid, and I'm sure that American troops already in South Korea are fighting on these front lines. Now when you actually look at North Korea and pick it apart, it's not that strong of a country. Sure, they have a lot of manpower, over 1 million, and they have a ballistic missile program, but like I said, we're throwing nukes out the window. And in aspect of those 1 million soldiers, they use very outdated equipment. A lot of their equipment is Soviet era equipment versus South Korea's late 20th, early 21st century equipment. So yeah, North Korea probably wouldn't do too good here unless China sends aid, which I'm sure they are. But a big naval battle is also in progress now, with the blue team having a slight advantage against China because China's navy isn't as good as a lot of people think it is. So I'm mainly going to be focusing on the Eastern European front now because that is going to be the most important front of this war. Fighting off and invading China seems pretty unlikely for the blue team, as they'd most likely be exhausted from fighting off Russia. In the Baltics, the NATO team manages to kick out all of the Russians, and it is at this point that Russian troops retreat from Belarus as the entire country falls to NATO. In Ukraine, we have a similar problem for Russia as NATO troops start to completely kick out the Russians. We have a naval landing being made in Crimea, which wipes out all of the Russian military infrastructure in the island, and NATO is basically just pushing around and capturing major cities at this point. After losing even more ground to NATO, eventually we have Russia retreating out of northern Ukraine, and after losing all access to the Black Sea via Ukraine, Russian troops were ordered out of southern Ukraine. So now Russia only holds on to the northern region of Ukraine and the Donbass region of Ukraine. Slowly but surely, NATO troops managed to push the Russians out of northern Ukraine, although there are some problems when pushing into eastern Ukraine. Down south in Turkey, we have Turkey pushing back even more Russian troops. And another aspect of this war that I do want to bring up is moral. Now, as of now in Ukraine, the moral of Russian soldiers is considerably low. Whereas in this war, I'm sure the moral of NATO troops would be high, as it's a big collective group of a bunch of countries all united under one alliance fighting against an aggressor. If that isn't motivation to fight, then I don't know what is. Russia doesn't really have the same logic, as the troops know that they're invading a NATO country and they know that they are the aggressors. Plus, realistically, Russia couldn't beat NATO, so I'm sure they had that in the back of their head as well. So as Russian troops are completely pushed out of Ukraine, we have Operation Russia going into play. After preparing, training, and resting a bunch of troops, we have NATO troops pushing out from the Baltics and starting an invasion of Russia. At the same time, NATO troops and Finnish troops push down from northern Russia, and we have the encirclement of St. Petersburg. From here, NATO troops continue to push over and across northwestern Russia, and a small advancement is made out of Ukraine. Finland makes a special operative to completely encircle this lake, which they do so successfully. And from here, we have Russia losing pretty much all of its northern territory over here in the west. But Russia isn't completely done yet, as they have a couple of counter invasions planned. The first of which is from eastern Ukraine. Now earlier I said that NATO was having some trouble invading this region, and that's because Russia had been building up. Russian troops in this area push out and capture Mariupol, and they sought to push down towards Crimea. NATO's offensive out of Ukraine fails as Russian troops push back in. And over in Belarus, Russian troops cross the border and start to take over a bit of the eastern portion of the country. Up north, Russia attempts to re-establish linkage with St. Petersburg, although it does fail as NATO troops hold out. Down south, the Russians manage to push back the Turks just a little bit, but eventually they are held at a stalemate. And yeah, that was Russia's big counteroffensive. So it was sort of successful. They didn't necessarily reach all of their goals, such as over here in St. Petersburg, but the Ukraine counteroffensive did go successfully, and they had managed to retake control of this body of water. And if you know me, I'm bad with names, so don't count on me to remember small areas like this. In East Asia, we have Japan and the US making a landing on Sakhalin. From here, they push up and take over the entire island, as it was mostly undefended. Speaking of undefended, we have the American and Japanese troops pushing around Siberia and taking over a majority of what would kind of be considered the habitable zone. The rest is just ice. In South Korea, we have a stalemate as blue team troops and Chinese troops fail to make any progress against each other, but we do have a landing in Taiwan, which leads to the liberation of the island. And this is assuming that the US and allies have full naval control of this area, in which they most likely do. You see, they don't have much of a naval battle between Russia because Russia doesn't have much water. And the only other place that the US would really have naval boats is in the Persian Gulf, which they most likely do, but nowhere near the amount they have in the Pacific Ocean. So assuming this is a scenario, China has lost naval supremacy. Russia's offensive in Ukraine continues to go as planned as they push across into more of eastern Ukraine. However, their offensive elsewhere are not going well. Belarus is completely kicked back into non-existence, and the spearhead that was pushing towards St. Petersburg is demolished. Now Russia is really in a bad situation as NATO troops are on the offensive and are starting to get near Moscow. That's an approximation. I think it's somewhere around here. So with that in mind, Russian troops are ordered to retreat from any areas they are invading and are ordered to defend the motherland. So with this, Russian troops retreat from the Caucasus, and only Iranian troops and Iraqi troops remain. Troops in Ukraine are ordered to retreat, although they do hold on to eastern Ukraine because they generally believe that it is a part of Russia. Something else that isn't going well for them is the capturing of Leningrad. And yeah, so Russia is really on the defensive now. In the Middle East, NATO troops arrive and start to help out Saudi Arabia and Turkey. We have Syria getting kicked back, and as well as Iraq as they lose their capital. The Iranians are kicked out of Saudi Arabia, and with the help of naval power in the Persian Gulf, we have a majority of the Persian Gulf area being captured by NATO and the blue team. Back up in the Caucasus, Turkish troops enter in to capture Armenia. We also have them capturing Azerbaijan, and Iranian troops are kicked out of Turkey. Soon after, NATO and blue team troops cross over into Iran, and we have Iran being put in a similar situation to Russia, and they have to play the defensive. Over in North Korea, we have China breaking a stalemate and pushing back the South Koreans. We even have them pushing over and into South Korea. In Europe, we have the last of Russia's special operations as all of their troops are kicked out. Now with a fully liberated Europe in NATO terms, we have the invasion of Russia. I'm going to say it now, it's not going to be like any other world leader's invasion of Russia. Now that Georgia is reestablished, we have NATO troops using it as an essential military base to invade southern Russia. I know mountains exist, but once again we're going to assume that they can invade through them. With complete control of the Black Sea, NATO makes a landing over here in Russia, and it is at this point in time that we have one ginormous front line against Russia. Now at this point, Russia is attempting to hold back NATO. Now they are kind of doing it successfully, although they are severely outnumbered against NATO troops. Some of their counter invasions do go well, although once again NATO is just outnumbering them, and slowly but surely NATO troops start to get towards Moscow. Now when at the gates of the city, we have one of the bloodiest battles of this war being fought, and this battle lasts for many weeks. Elsewhere, however, we do have NATO continuing their victory spree, and we have NATO troops crossing over into Kazakhstan. Now with this, Kazakhstan has an epiphany. Basically, they're just like, wait, why are we fighting this war again? And they decide to leave. Also, seeing the situation for their team not going in their favor, we have Mongolia exiting the war, and following suit is Kyrgyzstan. So now all we have fighting this war is Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea. Now don't get me wrong, these are strong countries. Two of them are in the top 3 strongest countries in the world, but in terms of winning this war, it really isn't looking in their favor. In the Middle East, Iran is kicked out of Iraq, and NATO troops push over and capture Taiwan. With this, the US makes even more landings along the southern coast of Iran until eventually the country is completely isolated. Iran does take advantage of its geographical geographical advantage, which is a lot of mountains over here, but ultimately NATO manages to connect with the US landings, and it is at this point that Iran surrenders. In Korea, we have the South Koreans pushing back and making a slight invasion of North Korea, but it is at this point in the war that both sides decide to meet for peace, and a peace treaty is drawn up. So yeah, now this entire world war has come to an end as the sides agree to meet for peace. Now almost all of the red team players have been wiped out across the globe, and yeah, it was an interesting war. So like I said, let's go ahead and take a look at this treaty. Starting off in the Americas, we have the Americans occupying and annexing all of Cuba, most likely making it a state, or also most likely making it a territory. In South America, we have Colombia getting a bit of land out of Venezuela, as well as Guyana. I forgot to erase that border. And the rest becomes a puppet of America. In the Middle East, we have the most interesting changes, I think. Turkey gets a large chunk out of Syria and Iraq, as well as a partition of Armenia. Speaking of which, Georgia and Azerbaijan both get land out of that, but Azerbaijan becomes a very large country as they annex land off of Russia and Iran. Georgia gets a small piece of Russia up here. I'm not really sure why I gave that to them, but you know, why not? Saudi Arabia gets a lot of land as Yemen is split between Oman and Saudi Arabia. Jordan and Israel are expanded, and Iraq becomes this oddly shaped country. This would most likely be combined with Iran, who received a new government. And yeah, so this is the Middle East now. In Europe, we have a pretty stereotypical AdizzPro treaty. Poland annexes Kaliningrad, as well as a small piece of Belarus. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all get their fair share. Finland reestablishes their old borders, but as well as expands down into Russia near St. Petersburg. Belarus receives a new government. Ukraine is expanded and looks very nice. And as for Russia itself, it also received a new government. In Asia, we have the least amount of changes. So the only change is the reestablishment of the 28th, 30th parallel. I honestly, I forgot the name. But yeah, the old Korean border is reestablished. We also have Japan getting all of Sakhalin back, as well as these Japanese islands, and Taiwan is left alone by China. So yeah, that's going to do it for the peace treaty of this video. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. Like I've said before, we're really close to 50,000 subscribers, and it would be amazing if we could hit that. Once again, Discord server is in the description and the pinned comment below. It's basically set up like a country, and it has a lot of cool mapping features. So if you're interested in joining, the link is up and working, and you can join below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.